and he's going to be speaking with us this morning on our conference scripture, which is Isaiah 49. So at AMBS, David serves as managing editor of the Institute of Mennonite Studies, which is AMBS's publishing agency, and as a sessional instructor in theology and ethics. I appreciate how David is immersed in both the academic world and the church. He also serves as teaching pastor at Keller Park Church in South Bend, which is a congregation in the missionary church tradition. And he has close ties with Bethel University in Mishawaka, Indiana, which is also affiliated with the missionary church. Previously, David was associate editor at Baker Academic and Brazos Press in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's a writer who's actively sharing the good news of Anabaptism in the public sphere. Books that he has co-edited or co-authored include The Activist Impulse, Essays on the Intersection of Evangelicalism and Anabaptism, and A Field Guide to Christian Nonviolence, which is forthcoming. His writing has appeared in Christian Century, The Mennonite, and Sojourners, and I'll encourage you before the break to check out his Anabaptist Revisions blog, which is on Patheos' Evangelical channel. So welcome, David. I'm glad to turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Annette. I'd like to start by reading from Isaiah 40, verses 1 to 11 together. And I'm reading from the New International Version, which I've slightly modified for gender inclusivity. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one calling, in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a pathway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? All people are like grass, and all their faithfulness is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely people are grass. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord remains forever. You who bring good news to Zion, go up on a high mountain. You who bring good news to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up, do not be afraid. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. See, the sovereign Lord comes with power, and God rules with a mighty arm. See, the Lord's reward is coming with God, and the Lord's recompense accompanies God. The Lord tends God's flock like a shepherd, and the Lord gathers the lambs in God's arms and carries them close to God's heart. The Lord gently leads those that have young. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, I confess that I was not a part of the planning committee for this conference, and so I didn't know what exactly went into the decision to select Isaiah 40, verse 9 as a thematic text. But whether it's by design or by fortunate happenstance or a little bit of both, this text is particularly fitting for our gathering this week. And that for at least three reasons. First, according to the Revised Common Lectionary, it's the Old Testament reading for the second Sunday of Advent. It's quoted in all four Gospels in reference to John the Baptist preparing the way for the coming of the Messiah or Lord. So for those of you whose churches follow the lectionary, this text will likely be read, if not preached on, this coming Sunday. And for those of you who, like me, preach weekly from the lectionary, this morning's devotional might assist with this weekend's sermon writing. Second, this text is addressed to a people, indeed to a nation, that is slowly emerging from a prolonged, painful experience of collective trauma. Old Testament scholars observe that verses 1 to 11 serve as the prologue to the major second unit of Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55. The first unit, chapters 1 to 39, speaks words of God's judgment on Judah for its sin, idolatry, and oppression. This section precedes the ultimate judgment of the people in 587 BCE, when Jerusalem is conquered and destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, and many of its people are taken into exile. In contrast, the second unit of Isaiah is written to the people of Judah as they are returning from exile. As Old Testament scholar Michael Chan observes, the exile is anticipated in chapter 39 and then only assumed in chapter 40. It's as if the editors didn't need to, or perhaps couldn't bear to, talk about that time when God handed over God's beloved daughter Zion into the hands of a vicious foreign army. Chan thus describes how the author is forced to preach to an audience that had experienced trauma and whose relationship to God had been deeply wounded as a result. For this audience, God's hiddenness was far more real than God's presence. Well, as with post-exilic Judah, I think we too are in a moment of hopefully emerging, however slowly it may be, from a period of collective trauma. Between a pandemic that's taken nearly 300,000 lives in the United States alone and has caused untold suffering around the world this year, and the magnitude of racial and sexualized violence that many of us are just beginning to comprehend, we are a traumatized people. Well, third, this passage is addressed not to the people themselves, but to the messenger or messengers to the people. It's addressed quite literally to those charged with bringing the good news to the people, to the herald who brings the press, we might say. This passage, in other words, is about words. It's about communication. Old Testament scholar John Goldingay writes, the importance of the notion of communication in verses 1 to 11 is indicated by the frequent use of the words for communication. Say 4 times, speak twice, call out 4 times, raise the voice twice. This passage is substantively about words. Well, the theme of our conference is a question: what's good news? And for this morning's devotional reflections, I'd like us to personalize this question. What's the good news that I have to communicate? And in addition to this question, I'd like us to consider 2 further related questions. For whom is the news I have to communicate good? And secondly, or thirdly, how can I communicate this news in a way that it is heard as good? So first, what's the good news I have to communicate? Well, having grown up in evangelical context and come into the Anabaptist fold in my early 20s, I spent a fair amount of time wrestling with the age-old question, what is the gospel? Is it the spiritualized message that I learned in my evangelical childhood and youth? Or is it the social message that I was encountering in my reading of Anabaptist historians and Bible scholars? Or perhaps it's the political message I was encountering among my more radical Anabaptist theologian and activist friends. These questions led me to write an entire dissertation on the influence of the early 20th century social gospel theologian Walter Rauschenbusch on contemporary Anabaptist theology and ethics. But now that I'm in pastoral ministry, I've come to reject any kind of essentializing definition of the gospel. The gospel, or from the Greek evangelion or euangelion, just means good news. And good news is just news that is good. For those returning from exile in Babylon, the good news was the simple but profound message of comfort. Their sins had been paid for. They will again see the glory of the Lord. The Lord will protect them and gently shepherd them. According to Ivan Friesen, this prologue announcing good tidings presents a theology of hope resting on a foundation of the Lord's power and presence. For Jewish peasants in first century Palestine, the good news was the arrival of their long-awaited Messiah, who would reveal the salvation, deliverance, or liberation of God. For many who heard Walter Rauschenbusch preach, the good news is that the kingdom of God is advancing on earth as it is in heaven. For many who heard Billy Graham preach, the good news is that they could have peace with God. As Oshida so poignantly shared yesterday afternoon, the good news for many of our sisters and brothers of color today is that Black lives matter. In hindsight, it's kind of silly to do so much hand-wringing over the definition of good news. We know good news when we hear it. And just because a message of good news isn't the comprehensive message of good news for all times and all places, doesn't make it any less good or any less news. Which leads to our second question. For whom is the news I have to communicate good? As an editor at Baker, Brazos, and now at the Institute of Mennonite Studies, I've had the pleasure of reviewing many a book proposal. And there's one question on every book proposal that provides a dead giveaway about how realistic the author is about their project. The question is this: who do you envision as the intended audience of your book? You'd be surprised at how many authors write something to this effect. Although this project is written with scholars in mind, it could be used in an undergrad or seminary course, or read by pastors, or your average person in the pew. What that kind of answer indicates immediately is that the author has no idea who the message is for, which means there's a good chance it's not for anyone. As it turns out, the average person in the pew doesn't find academic Mennonite theology all that interesting. I'm sad to say, as somebody who works at the Institute of Mennonite Studies. Nor do academic Mennonite theologians tend to find books written for the average person in the pew that interesting. As much as we like to believe that our good news should be good news for everyone, more often than not, there's a specific audience who needs to hear it. For the prologue to what's sometimes called 2nd Isaiah, the good news is for the people of Zion or Jerusalem and the surrounding towns of Judah. As Kristen Wendland observes, at the end of this passage, the city of Jerusalem, also identified as Zion, is personified. This is a common trope in Isaiah 40 to 66. However, the place in the Old Testament in which Zion is personified most consistently is the first 2 chapters of the book of Lamentations. In Lamentations 1 and 2, daughter Zion cries out against the destruction wrought her. She speaks words of accusations against her human enemies and even God. The refrain that comes again and again is, there is no one to comfort her. At the end of her speeches, and even at the end of the book of Lamentations, daughter Zion receives no response to her cry. The response to Zion's laments comes rather in other biblical books. The response comes in verses such as Isaiah 41, comfort, O comfort my people. The response comes in verses such as Isaiah 49, in which the words for Jerusalem to speak are not those of lament, but of good news. She is no longer told to wail, but to raise her voice without fear. The message given is confident and hopeful. Here is your God. Here is a God who comes to feed the flock, to gather the lambs, to lead the mother sheep, to bring comfort. Here is God in whom one may have hope. We're all familiar with Jesus' inaugural sermon in Luke 4, where he reads from this same section of the scroll of Isaiah to proclaim, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is a message of good news with a concrete and specific audience. And while it was received by its intended audience as good news, there were many others for whom it was heard as a threat to their way of life. Remember that whole trying to throw Jesus off the cliff thing? Well, ultimately, the liberation of the oppressed is good for both the oppressed and the oppressor. it's more likely to be heard as good by the former than the latter. Which leads us to our third and final question. How can I communicate this news in a way that it is heard as good? This prologue is an extended introduction on how to communicate the good news in a way that it's heard as good by a traumatized people. In verse 2, the prophet is told to comfort God's people and speak tenderly to them. But at the same time, in verse 9, the heralds of good news are instructed to go up on a high mountain and lift your voice with a shout. Lift it up, do not be afraid. Again, Michael Chan sees in this preaching a primer on preaching. Isaiah 41-11, he writes, represents the very best kind of preaching. It's a kind of preaching that's grounded in the proclamation and promise, but shaped fundamentally by careful listening to those things that afflict the hearts of his audience. Great preaching, one might say, involves 2 ears and 1 mouth. Like all of us, 2nd Isaiah was forced to preach to an audience that had experienced trauma and whose relationship to God had been deeply wounded as a result. For this audience, God's hiddenness was far more real than God's presence, and the preacher's job, at least in part, is to point to those places where God is present. Here is your God. Yesterday afternoon, Oshita challenged us to pursue peace by building others up instead of just by calling others out. She shared how she tries to humanize an issue by telling stories from her own experiences or the experiences of others. That is the comforting, tender side of how. But there's also the lift up your voice, lift it up, do not be afraid side. And this is where Oshita calls dear white peacemakers to speak up and speak out on behalf of racial justice. Don't be afraid to say the wrong thing or be guilty of white-splaining, she says. Instead, use your voice to proclaim the good news that Black lives matter to you and to God. Well, this morning I've given us 3 questions to consider. And in a few moments, if we have time here, we'll break into groups to discuss how we're processing these questions for ourselves. We've put these questions into the dialogue box there. But before we split up, let me conclude with a very brief story about how I'm answering these questions in my context. I'm speaking to you this morning from the sanctuary of Keller Park Church in South Bend, Indiana, where I'm the teaching pastor. This sanctuary is empty today and will be mostly empty on Sunday when we stream our virtual service. But while we haven't gathered indoors as a church for worship for about 9 months, our sanctuary is getting more use than ever. Back in mid-March, when we received word that the South Bend Community Schools would be closing in light of orders to shelter in place, we knew this meant many of the kids in our neighborhood would go without adequate nutrition, since many of them rely on school meals throughout the week. And so on March 16th, our congregation sprang into action. Overnight, we transformed our sanctuary into a food distribution center. We stacked chairs and put tables in their place. Boxes of cereal and bottles of water filled the front of the stage where music equipment once stood. We assembled a small but dedicated team of food preparers and distributors from those who live in walking distance to the church, and the rest contributed by making donations to our new COVID-19 response fund. For the first 3 months or so, we served 3 hot meals out of the church a week, and in the summer months, we switched to 1 hot meal in addition to a food box. On Thanksgiving Day, knowing that many people wouldn't be traveling to see family or wouldn't have the means to prepare a traditional meal, the pastors and our kids, along with another family, met here in the sanctuary to make an assembly line right here where I'm sitting, and we served 125 Thanksgiving meals in an hour. And some might look at this use of the space as a nice soup kitchen or food pantry, but not as the work of the gospel, the work of good news. But for our neighborhood, reeling from the physical and economic trauma we're experiencing from the pandemic, a hot meal and a food box is the most tangible kind of good news we could offer. This was recently confirmed in an email my co-pastor received following the distribution, with which I'll conclude. Hello, I'm sorry I took a hiatus from email for a bit. Yes, we did come to the Thanksgiving meal distribution, and we're blessed by the church's generosity. Thank you so much. My grandma, 97 years old, has developed the signs of dementia over this past year. My parents just moved in with her to take care of her. Lately, she's been getting fixated on one word or phrase and says it repeatedly. Anyway, after picking up the food from you, we went home and sat down to eat. Grandma's mantra became, "Good food." I'm not exaggerating when I say that she said it at least 25 times during dinner, and we all agreed. So again, I just want to say thank you. And thanks to all of you for your time.
Okay, you will now be